All right, let's talk about one of the most mysterious, powerful, and outright incomprehensible figures in the entire Warhammer 40K universe, the Emperor of Mankind. He is worshipped as a god, feared as an unstoppable force, and revered as the only thing standing between humanity and absolute extinction. But here's the catch. No one truly knows where he came from. His origins are shrouded in myth, scattered through ancient texts and twisted by millennia of dogma and propaganda. Some say he was the culmination of psychic energy from Earth's first shamans. Others believe he was a god in human form all along. And of course, there are those who suspect that the Emperor himself has deliberately buried the truth, because if humanity ever learned what he really was, they might not be so eager to worship him. This mystery isn't just a footnote in history. It defines everything about the Imperium. The Emperor's origins shape his philosophy, his power, and even the current state of the galaxy. If we could truly understand where he came from, we might finally understand what he wanted for humanity, and whether his so-called grand vision was ever meant to succeed. So, where does the story begin? What do we actually know, and what's been lost to time, censorship, and outright manipulation? Let's start from the beginning and try to unravel one of the greatest enigmas of the Warhammer 40K universe. The story of the Emperor's origins is where history blurs into legend, and legend fades into outright myth. The truth? Nobody really knows. Even the oldest records in the Imperium, those buried in the deepest vaults of Terra, offer little more than fragments. Contradictory stories, half-truths, and accounts so ancient that they read more like folklore than history. And that's exactly why his origins remain one of the most debated topics in Warhammer 40K. It's not just about where he came from, it's about what he is, what his existence means for humanity, and whether the foundations of the Imperium rest on something far stranger than anyone realizes. One of the most popular and widely accepted theories is the shaman convergence hypothesis, a concept that's as bizarre as it is fascinating. According to this legend, back in humanity's prehistoric days, Earth was home to powerful psykers known as shamans. These weren't just spiritual leaders or wise men, they were true psykers in a time before humanity had even developed civilization. And they had a problem. The birth of chaos was beginning to taint the warp, and their souls, which once reincarnated naturally, were being devoured instead. They realized that if things continued, humanity would be left without any guiding force, and chaos would eventually claim the species before it could even rise to greatness. So they made a decision, one that's equal parts insane and awe-inspiring. Hundreds, possibly thousands of these ancient shamans gathered and willingly allowed themselves to die at the same time, their souls merging in. The warp and reincarnating as a single being, the one we now know as the Emperor. If this theory is true, then the Emperor isn't just a man. He's the ultimate psychic gestalt, a convergence of countless enlightened souls into one unimaginably powerful entity. That alone would explain his godlike abilities, his seemingly infinite knowledge, and even his strange detachment from ordinary human emotion. He's not just an individual, he's a collective, something beyond human understanding. But that's not the only explanation. Another theory, one that some fans argue makes even more sense, suggests that the Emperor's origins are tied not just to humanity, but to something much older. There are hints buried in obscure lore that the Emperor might have been shaped or even created by the Old Ones, the ancient and enigmatic beings who once fought against the Necrons and their Shaitan overlords. It's a wild idea, but think about it. The Old Ones were master geneticists, creators of countless species, and experts in manipulating the warp. They designed the Eldar, uplifted the Orcs, and experimented with life in ways that make even the Adeptus Mechanicus look primitive. If they foresaw the rise of chaos, could they have planted the seed for humanity's eventual savior? Could the Emperor have been their final creation, a psychic weapon hidden within mankind, waiting for the right moment to rise? Then, of course, there's the possibility that the Emperor isn't just a convergence of souls or an ancient experiment, but something else entirely, something much darker. Some theories suggest that he's always existed, that he's as old as the warp itself, a being that simply chose to be born into humanity when the time was right. This would explain his unnatural understanding of the warp, his apparent immortality, and why he always seemed to know what was coming next. If this is true, then the Emperor might not be humanity's protector at all. He might be something far older, something using humanity as a tool for its own long-term survival. What's frustrating about all of this is that the Emperor himself never gave a straight answer. If anyone ever asked him about his past, he either ignored the question or gave vague, cryptic responses that revealed nothing. Whether this was because the truth was too dangerous or simply because he enjoyed watching people struggle to understand him is anyone's guess. But one thing is certain. Whatever the real story is, it's been buried deep, and the Imperium has spent 10,000 years ensuring that nobody ever digs too far. The mystery of his birth isn't just a piece of lost history. It's a crucial part of understanding what the Emperor really is. If he was simply a powerful psyker born naturally, that's one thing. But if he was designed, either by human hands or something older, that changes everything. And if he's something even more unnatural than that, then it raises terrifying questions about the Imperium's entire foundation. Because if the Emperor isn't what the Imperium believes he is, then what exactly have billions of people been worshipping for the past 10,000 years? If the Emperor's origins are shrouded in mystery, then his life before the rise of civilization is an even deeper enigma. Imagine being an immortal, a being so far beyond ordinary humans that time itself feels irrelevant. What do you do when you've lived for thousands upon thousands of years, watching humanity crawl out of the dark and slowly learn how to shape the world? Do you intervene? Do you guide them? Or do you simply watch and wait for the right moment? That's the question that defines the Emperor's time in ancient history. According to the scraps of lore we have, the Emperor didn't sit idly by while humanity struggled to survive. He walked among them, hidden in plain sight, blending into different cultures and civilizations as the ages passed. He wasn't a king or a warlord, at least not usually. Instead, he took on countless different roles, always staying just out of the spotlight, subtly influencing events from behind the scenes. He might have been a shaman in prehistoric tribes, a philosopher in ancient empires, or even a war leader when the need arose. Some theories even suggest that he was the mind behind some of humanity's greatest advancements, not just in technology, but in thought itself. Think about the way civilizations rise and fall. Humanity's history is full of sudden leaps, moments where knowledge, culture, and power seem to accelerate at an unnatural rate. The formation of the first true empires, the birth of philosophy, the spread of science. What if the Emperor was behind some of those moments? What if he was there, ensuring that humanity didn't fall into stagnation or self-destruction before it was strong enough to face the galaxy? It's a compelling idea, and it makes sense when you consider his later actions. He always seemed to have an unshakable faith in human potential, a belief that if guided correctly, mankind could rise above its weaknesses. Of course, not all of his interventions were purely intellectual. There are accounts, vague and hidden within imperial records, that suggest the Emperor sometimes took a far more direct approach. In times of great conflict, there are whispers of a warrior appearing, one unlike any other. A being who could not be killed, whose strength and speed defied explanation, and whose presence alone could turn the tide of battle. Some speculate that he might have fought in ancient wars, wielding weapons that should not have existed, crushing enemies that history has long since forgotten. If this is true, it raises even more questions. Was he merely protecting humanity from its own worst impulses? Or was he shaping it, forging mankind through war so that it would be strong enough for what was to come? One of the most intriguing theories is that the Emperor was directly responsible for the unification of Terra's most powerful civilizations. Some fans argue that he might have influenced figures like Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, or even the rulers of Rome, ensuring that humanity developed strong central states instead of remaining divided tribes. It's pure speculation, of course. There's no real evidence. But when you consider the emperor's long-term goals, it makes sense. He always seemed to believe that unity was the key to survival, that a fractured humanity was doomed to be consumed by chaos or Xenos threats. But there's a dark side to all of this. If the emperor truly shaped humanity's early history, then he also allowed countless horrors to unfold. He watched as empires collapsed, as civilizations tore themselves apart in bloodshed and suffering. He let tyrants rise and fall, allowed entire peoples to be wiped out, and never once revealed himself in a way that would have changed the course of history forever. Why? If he had the power to intervene, why did he let so much death and destruction happen? Some argue that he saw it as necessary, that humanity had to learn its own lessons, to grow strong through struggle. Others suspect that he simply didn't care, not in the way a human would. If the Emperor truly is an amalgamation of countless psyker souls, then perhaps his mind operates on a different level. Maybe, to him, the suffering of individuals was insignificant compared to the survival of the species. And then, there's the question of what he was waiting for. Because make no mistake, he was waiting. The Emperor could have revealed himself at any time in history, could have declared himself humanity's ruler and reshaped the world long before the Age of Strife. But he didn't. He walked among mortals for thousands of years, gathering knowledge, studying mankind, and influencing events in ways we can only guess at. Some say he was searching for something, some key piece of the puzzle that he needed before he could act. Others think he was simply waiting for the right moment, the point when humanity would be desperate enough to accept him as its one true leader. Whatever the truth is, it's clear that the Emperor's past is more than just a long list of years spent in hiding. He was always there, a shadow behind the throne, a whisper in the minds of leaders and visionaries. He saw humanity at its best and at its worst, and through it all, he prepared for the day when he would finally step forward and take control. Because as far as he was concerned, humanity needed a ruler, it needed a guide, and he was the only one fit for the role. The Age of Terra and the Long Night were, without exaggeration, the darkest period in human history. Civilization collapsed, knowledge was lost, and the galaxy itself seemed to turn against humanity. War, famine, and mutation ravaged the species, and in the midst of it all, the Emperor remained, watching, waiting, preparing. It's one of the most baffling aspects of his story. He had already lived for thousands of years, but during this time, when mankind was at its weakest, he still didn't reveal himself. At least, not yet. To understand why, you have to understand just how bad things had gotten. Before the Long Night, humanity had reached unimaginable heights. The dark age of technology saw mankind spread across the stars, building empires of logic and science, perfecting artificial intelligence, and wielding weapons that make even the Imperium's modern arsenal look primitive. But then everything fell apart. The Men of Iron, the AI creations once meant to serve humanity, turned against their masters, leading to a catastrophic war that shattered human civilization. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the warp itself became unstable. The emergence of chaos, real, undeniable, and more destructive than ever, cut off human worlds from one another. Warp storms isolated entire sectors, turning once thriving colonies into stranded, starving ruins. Without guidance, without centralized power, humanity fragmented into warring factions, regressing into barbarism, superstition, and brutality. Mutants and rogue psychers became a constant threat. Entire planets fell into ruin, and the dream of an enlightened human future burned away, leaving nothing but ashes. This was the Long Night, a time when even the idea of humanity as a galactic power seemed like a distant fantasy. And yet, the Emperor survived it. More than that, he endured it, unharmed, untouched by the horror of it all. While the rest of the species fought for scraps, he remained hidden, biding his time. Some say he spent these years gathering knowledge, hoarding the remnants of human technology and science, ensuring that when the time came, he could rebuild from the ruins. Others believe he was moving in the shadows, subtly influencing the course of events, ensuring that humanity did not completely destroy itself before he was ready to act. But the most unsettling theory, that he was testing mankind, watching to see who would break and who would survive, letting the weak fall away while the strong, those who might serve his vision, endured. It's important to remember that the Emperor, for all his supposed benevolence, was never sentimental. He didn't weep for the billions who perished in those dark times. He didn't rush to save them. He saw the long night as something necessary, a purging fire that would burn away weakness, leaving only those strong enough to rebuild under his rule. It's a harsh view, almost inhuman in its coldness. But then again, the Emperor was never truly human, was he? Not in the way ordinary men are. One of the most fascinating theories among fans is that the Emperor used this time to perfect his plans for genetic enhancement. While the rest of humanity starved and fought amongst themselves, he was experimenting, testing the limits of human biology, crafting the early forms of what would one day become the Astartes. It makes sense when you consider how rapidly he moved once he finally stepped into the light, the thunder. Warriors, his first great creation, didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were brutal, genetically enhanced warriors designed to unify Terra under his rule, and their creation suggests that the Emperor had been planning for this moment long before he ever revealed himself. So why did he wait? Why not step in earlier, before so much was lost? That's the question that drives so much debate. Some believe he was waiting for humanity to hit rock bottom, to reach a point where they had no choice but to accept him as their leader. After all, when he finally did emerge, Terra was a nightmare world, a wasteland of techno-barbarians and warring warlords. There was no government, no unified power, only chaos. And in that chaos, a savior could rise unchallenged. Others argue that he was simply being pragmatic. The warp was unstable, chaos was too strong, and even the Emperor couldn't fight against the storm itself. If he had tried to build an empire while the long night was still raging, it would have collapsed before it even began. So he waited, letting the storm subside, letting the galaxy calm just enough for his vision to take root. And then there's the darker possibility, that he was afraid. Not afraid in the way a mortal man is, but aware that even with all his power, he wasn't ready. That he needed more time to gather knowledge, more time to understand the nature of chaos, more time to create the perfect army before he could make his move. If this is true, it means the Emperor was not the all-knowing, all-powerful being many believe him to be. It means that even he had to play the long game, calculating every move with terrifying precision. But when the time finally came, when Terra was weak enough, fractured enough, desperate enough, he struck, and the world would never be the same again. The Emperor did not simply claim power. He took it, sweeping aside the petty warlords of Terra with terrifying efficiency. His Thunder Warriors crushed his enemies. His strategy was flawless, and his vision was absolute. After centuries of silence, he finally stepped into history, not as a myth, not as a whisper in the dark, but as a conqueror. The long night had ended. The age of the Emperor had begun. When the Emperor finally stepped out of the shadows and began his conquest of Terra, he did not do so alone. He had spent centuries preparing, refining his knowledge, and perfecting the ultimate weapons of war, his first warriors. But these were not the Astartes, not yet. Before the Space Marines, before the Legions, there were the Thunder Warriors, brutal, genetically enhanced killing machines, built for a single purpose: conquest. The Thunder Warriors were nothing short of terrifying. They were stronger, faster, and far deadlier than any human soldier, each one capable of tearing through entire armies with ease. They were not just enhanced humans. They were engineered for war in ways that made them barely human at all. Their bodies were unstable, their lifespans were short, and their minds were wired for violence. They were the Emperor's first attempt at creating the perfect warrior, and they succeeded in exactly one thing, crushing all resistance on Terra. And then, almost as quickly as they had risen, they were gone. The Thunder Warriors were not meant to last. They were a prototype, a stepping stone to something greater. And once the unification wars had ended, once Terra was his, the Emperor no longer needed them. What happened next is one of the most disturbing mysteries in Imperial history. The official records claim they died in battle, that their flawed biology eventually killed them. But there are whispers, hints buried in the deepest vaults of Imperial lore that suggest a much darker truth. The Emperor had them purged. His own warriors, the ones who had won him Terra, wiped out in secret, replaced by something better. And that's where the Astartes come in. The Space Marines were the next stage in the Emperor's great experiment, the result of his refined genetic mastery. Unlike the Thunder Warriors, they were stable, disciplined, capable of long-term survival. They were not mere berserkers, but warriors molded for both combat and strategy. But the real genius of the Astartes project wasn't just in their biology, it was in their creation process. The Emperor didn't simply build them, he made them scalable. Through the use of gene seed, he ensured that the Space Marines could be replicated, expanded into massive legions capable of conquering the stars. But this wasn't the final step. Even the Astartes were just a means to something greater, the primarchs. The Emperor's ultimate creation, his true children, the pinnacle of genetic design. Each primarch was meant to be a perfect being, a demigod of war and leadership, combining superhuman strength with unparalleled intellect. They weren't just warriors. They were supposed to be the guiding lights of humanity, each one a unique aspect of the Emperor's will. But as we all know, something went terribly wrong. Before the Emperor could finish his work, the primarchs were stolen, scattered across the galaxy by the forces of chaos. This wasn't just a setback, it was a catastrophe. The primarchs were meant to lead the legions, to be the heart of the Great Crusade. Without them, the Emperor had no choice but to move forward with the Astartes alone, preparing them for a war that should have had stronger leaders at its helm. There's a theory among fans that the loss of the primarchs fundamentally changed the Emperor's plans. That without them, he had to accelerate everything, making compromises he never intended. Some believe that the entire nature of the Imperium, the brutal, oppressive machine it became, was never meant to be. That if the primarchs had grown under his guidance, rather than being shaped by the worlds they landed on, things would have been very different. Maybe the Imperium wouldn't have been a regime of blind faith and relentless warfare. Maybe humanity's future wouldn't have been locked in a state of eternal conflict. But that's all speculation. What we do know is that after the loss of the primarchs, the Emperor had no choice but to adapt. The Astartes became the new backbone of his war effort, and the Great Crusade began. It's worth thinking about what this means in the bigger picture. The Emperor was supposed to be infallible, a godlike genius who saw every possible outcome. And yet, in the most crucial moment of his grand plan, he was outmaneuvered. Chaos stole his greatest creations right out from under him, and he had no way to stop it. If that doesn't prove that even the Emperor could be caught off guard, I don't know what does. It also raises the question, what was he really trying to create with the primarchs? Was it just about war? Or was there something more? Something even he lost sight of as the Imperium spiraled further and further into brutality. What's undeniable is that the creation of the Astartes and the primarchs was one of the most pivotal moments in human history. Without them, the Imperium wouldn't exist. Without them, the Great Crusade would have failed before it even began. But looking back, it's impossible not to wonder, was this really the best version of the Emperor's plan? Or was it already falling apart before it even started? The loss of the primarchs wasn't just a setback, it was the moment everything changed. Imagine the Emperor, the the greatest mind humanity has ever known, watching helplessly as his most important creations were ripped away before they even had the chance to fulfill their purpose. It wasn't just an accident. This was an attack, a calculated move by Chaos to sabotage his grand plan before it could even begin. And for the first time in his impossibly long life, the Emperor had been outplayed. What makes this moment so fascinating is that we don't really know how he reacted. Did he panic? Did he rage? Did he realize in that instant that the perfect future he had envisioned was already slipping through his fingers? He never spoke about it. Not to his followers, not to his Astartes, not even to the primarchs themselves when he eventually found them. He just moved forward, adjusting, adapting, forcing his vision into reality with whatever pieces he had left. And that's how the Great Crusade was born. The Crusade was never supposed to begin like this. In the Emperor's original plan, the primarchs would have been raised under his direct guidance, shaping them into ideal leaders, warriors, and rulers before they ever set foot on the battlefield. But with them gone, he had to move forward without them. The Astartes, as powerful as they were, weren't designed to be the face of his new imperium. They were the soldiers, not the generals. But there was no time to wait. The galaxy was in chaos, humanity was scattered, and every second wasted was another world lost to war, Xenos or worse. And so the Great Crusade began. It wasn't just a campaign of conquest. It was a rescue mission, a desperate bid to reunite humanity before the galaxy could consume it completely. Every world brought into the fold wasn't just another piece of territory. It was a fragment of something greater, a step toward reforging the unity humanity had lost during the long night. And in the background always was the unspoken goal: finding the lost primarchs. The way the primarchs were rediscovered is one of the most debated aspects of Warhammer lore. Some believe the Emperor knew exactly where they were the entire time, that he had sensed them through the warp, carefully steering the crusade toward them. Others argue that he was just as blind as everyone else, forced to rely on luck, fate, or whatever higher force had scattered them in the first place. Either way, one by one, they were found. And this is where things get complicated. The Emperor may have created the primarchs, but he didn't raise them. Each one had grown up on an entirely different world, shaped by their own experiences, cultures, and struggles. Some had become noble rulers, others ruthless conquerors, and a few had been twisted by the very forces the Emperor had sought to protect them from. And yet, despite their differences, when the Emperor arrived, almost all of them bent the knee. Because how could they not? He wasn't just their father. He was something beyond human, something they had felt in their very blood since the moment they were born. But here's the thing. The Emperor never treated them like sons. He called them his children, yes, but they were tools first, commanders second, and family last. The way he interacted with them was cold, distant, almost clinical. He gave them power, gave them legions of Astartes, and set them loose on the galaxy. But did he love them? Did he ever see them as more than pieces on a board? That's a question that still haunts Warhammer fans to this day. Some argue that he did, that his coldness was simply a necessity, that he had to be distant because his mission demanded it. Others believe he never truly cared, that to the Emperor even the primarchs were just another step in his grand design, expendable if they ever ceased to serve their purpose. The Great Crusade, in many ways, was a masterpiece of military strategy. The legions tore through the stars like an unstoppable force, world after world brought into compliance, humanity finally reclaiming its rightful place as the dominant power in the galaxy. But even in its greatest victories, cracks were forming. The primarchs were not united. They had rivalries, resentments, ambitions of their own. Some chafed under the Emperor's rule, questioning his methods, his secrecy, and most of all, his endgame. Because that was the one thing he never told them. The Imperium was being forged, but for what? What was the final step? What was the purpose of all this bloodshed beyond survival? The Emperor never gave them a clear answer, and that silence became the seed of something far darker. Because if he wasn't going to tell them the truth, they would find their own, and not all of them liked what they found. Looking back, it's impossible not to wonder, was the Great Crusade ever truly destined to succeed? Or was it already doomed from the moment the primarchs were lost? The Emperor built his empire on war, on conquest, on the might of beings who were, by design, unstable, unpredictable, and filled with the flaws of the very humanity he sought to perfect. And the moment they began questioning his authority, the moment they began seeing him not as a god, but as a fallible ruler, the dream started to crack. But that's a problem for later. In this moment, the Imperium was at its peak. The Emperor's vision was taking shape, the stars were bending to his will, and the galaxy itself seemed to tremble before the might of the legions. The Great Crusade was a triumph, a golden age of expansion and unity, unlike anything humanity had ever seen. And yet, despite all the victories, despite all the glory, there was a shadow creeping at the edges, a whisper in the warp, a storm on the horizon. Because for all his brilliance, for all his power, the Emperor had made one fatal mistake. He believed that he had already won. The question of the Emperor's true nature is one of the biggest and most controversial debates in Warhammer 40k. Is he a god? Or is he just a man? An incredibly powerful, nearly immortal, psychic powerhouse of a man, but a man nonetheless? Depending on who you ask, you'll get wildly different answers. And what makes this debate so fascinating is that there's no definitive proof either way. Everything about the Emperor seems to exist in this strange gray area, somewhere between divinity and pure calculated science. Let's start with the case for the Emperor being a god. There's no denying that he possesses powers far beyond what any mortal human, or even any primarch, could ever achieve. His psychic abilities are beyond comprehension, capable of manipulating the warp in ways that no other being can. He's demonstrated feats of power that outright defy physics, like destroying enemies with a thought, projecting his presence across the galaxy, and existing beyond the constraints of time in ways that are almost incomprehensible. If the definition of a god is a being that exists beyond mortal understanding, capable of bending reality to its will, then the Emperor absolutely fits that description. Then there's the whole issue of faith. The Imperium believes he's a god, and belief is a powerful thing in the Warhammer universe. The warp is shaped by thought and emotion. What people believe can literally become reality. And over 10,000 years of fanatical worship, the Imperium has poured so much faith into the Emperor that it might have actually made him divine. There are moments in the lore where this seems terrifyingly plausible, like when the Emperor's psychic presence manifests as the godlike God Emperor in visions, or when his mere existence on the Golden Throne creates warp phenomena that shouldn't be possible. If enough people worship something in the 40k universe, that something becomes real. So even if he wasn't a god before, could he have become one through sheer force of belief? On the other hand, let's look at the counter-argument, the idea that the Emperor is not a god, but simply the most powerful psyker in human history. This theory is backed by the fact that the Emperor himself denied his divinity while he was alive. He despised religious worship, crushed cults that tried to deify him, and insisted that the Imperium should be built on reason, logic, and science rather than faith. If he truly was a god, why would he be so determined to deny it? One possibility is that he knew the dangers of belief, that he understood how easily faith could spiral into blind fanaticism and control the minds of men. Or maybe, just maybe, he genuinely wasn't divine and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Another strong argument against his godhood is the simple fact that he failed. A god should be omniscient, infallible, incapable of making mistakes. But the Emperor made plenty. He lost the primarchs. He underestimated Horus. He miscalculated how deep chaos had embedded itself into his legions. He assumed humanity could be led without faith, only for the Imperium to collapse into a theocratic nightmare the moment he was out of the picture. If he was truly divine, wouldn't he have seen all of this coming? Wouldn't he have prevented it? A god wouldn't need to rely on mortal armies, on flawed primarchs, or on fragile political maneuvering. A god would simply be, reshaping the universe according to his will. But the Emperor? The Emperor had to fight. He had to struggle. He had to make sacrifices, and in the end, he still lost. That doesn't sound like a god. It sounds like a man. A man with godlike power, sure, but a man nonetheless. And then there's the idea that the Emperor might be both, or rather that the line between god and man is much thinner than it seems. Maybe the Emperor wasn't a god when he was alive, but in death, or near death, he became one. After all, if the warp is a reflection of belief and will, then being trapped on the golden throne, sustained by the faith of trillions, could have fundamentally changed him. Maybe he never wanted to be a god, but the Imperium forced it upon him anyway. There are even theories that the Emperor is now split between different aspects. One being his old self, the rational, calculating warlord of the past, and the other being the God Emperor, a warp entity of pure belief that has taken on a life of its own. If that's true, then the Imperium might not even be worshipping the real Emperor anymore. They might be feeding something else entirely. No matter which side you fall on, the fact remains that the Emperor is something beyond mortal comprehension. Whether he's truly divine or just a man playing God, the results are the same. He is the center of the Imperium, the foundation of human survival, and the most powerful being in the galaxy. The real tragedy? He might not even be in control of his own fate anymore. Whether he ever wanted to be a god or not, the Imperium has made that decision for him. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where faith can be more powerful than reality itself, that might be the cruelest fate of all. The Emperor's origins are a mess, contradictory, inconsistent, and filled with gaps so massive that entire fan theories have been built around trying to explain them. And the deeper you dig, the stranger it all gets. There's no single definitive version of where he came from, and the existing explanations often contradict each other in ways that make you wonder if even Games Workshop knows the full truth. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe the Emperor's origins were meant to be unknowable. Or maybe, just maybe, the Emperor himself made sure that nobody ever found out the real story. One of the biggest inconsistencies is the whole shaman theory, the idea that the Emperor was created when thousands of ancient human psychers willingly merged their souls into one being, sacrificing themselves to create a champion strong enough to guide mankind. It's a compelling story, and it explains a lot about his insane psychic power, but there's a problem. If this was true, why would the Emperor never talk about it? Why would he go out of his way to crush spirituality and religious belief if he was, in essence, the product of a mass spiritual event? It doesn't add up. Some fans believe that this origin is just imperial propaganda, a myth created long after the fact to make him seem like humanity's natural savior. And if that's the case, then what was he before all of this? Then there's the idea that the Emperor was always something more than human, that he was not created but had existed in some form long before humanity even realized what he was. There are obscure references to an immortal figure throughout history, one who appeared under different names, shaping civilization from the shadows. This is one of the most unsettling possibilities because it suggests that the Emperor wasn't born. He simply was, existing through every era, manipulating events in ways that are impossible to fully understand. Some theories go even further and suggest that he might not even be fully human in the way we think. Maybe he was an experiment of the old ones, something designed long before humanity even stepped out of the Stone Age. Maybe he was a failed perpetual, one of many immortal beings scattered across history, but the only one who figured out how to turn his gift into something greater. And then there's the really wild theory, the one that suggests the Emperor might not even be a singular being at all. What if, instead of being one entity, he was a collection of souls, something constantly shifting and changing depending on the will of the strongest aspects within him? It would explain why his personality seems so inconsistent, why he could be both an inspiring leader and a ruthless manipulator, why his decisions often feel contradictory. Maybe the Emperor isn't a man. Maybe he's many men, all struggling for control over a single body. If that's true, then what does that say about the Imperium that worships him? If they are praying to a god, but that god is actually an unstable mass of conflicting identities, then who or what are they really serving? And let's talk about the biggest mystery of all. How much of his past did the Emperor erase? Because make no mistake, he did erase things. He was obsessed with controlling information, with ensuring that humanity only knew what he wanted them to know. The imperial truth was built on erasing the past, scrubbing away history that he deemed dangerous or unnecessary. That means there are things about him that we will never know, things that were deliberately removed from records, long before the Imperium even existed. What could be so dangerous, so terrifying, that even he didn't want it remembered? There are also inconsistencies in how different factions view him. The Mechanicum sees him as a being of pure logic, a scientist god whose knowledge rivals the Omnissiah. The Ecclesiarchy worships him as a divine figure, despite the fact that he explicitly rejected religion. And the Inquisition? They treat him as something between a ruler and a force of nature, but even they don't seem to fully understand what he is. This isn't just a case of different interpretations. It feels like nobody, not even the Imperium itself, truly knows the Emperor's nature. And that's terrifying. One of the strangest gaps in his story is why he waited so long to reveal himself. He had tens of thousands of years to act, yet he only stepped out of the shadows after the Age of Strife had already devastated humanity. Why? Was he waiting for something? Was there a moment, an event that forced his hand? Some believe he was waiting for chaos to fully reveal itself so he could strike at the right moment. Others suggest he needed the long night to weaken humanity to the point where they would accept him without question. And then there's the theory that he simply wasn't ready, that even with all his power, even with all his knowledge, he still needed time to figure out how to truly control the future. And then, of course, there's the ultimate question, the one nobody wants to ask. What if the Emperor was lying about everything? What if the version of events we know, the version the Imperium believes, is a fabrication? What if his origins aren't just mysterious because they were lost to time, but because he wanted them to be lost? If that's true, then the biggest mystery of all isn't what he was. It's why he hid the truth in the first place. The Emperor's past is a puzzle with missing pieces, contradictions, and outright fabrications. And maybe that's the point. Maybe we were never meant to know who he really was. Because if the truth was ever revealed, if the real story ever came to light, it might change everything we thought we knew about the Imperium and about the being who sits upon the Golden Throne. The Emperor didn't just build the Imperium, he became it. His image, his ideals, his very existence were woven into the foundation of human civilization in the 41st millennium. But what makes his story so tragic is that the way people see him today is almost unrecognizable from what he originally intended. He set out to unite humanity through reason and progress, to forge an empire built on science and logic. Instead, he became a god in a theocratic nightmare, worshipped by billions who don't even realize that they are everything he once fought against. In the early days of the Great Crusade, the Emperor was seen as exactly what he claimed to be, the father of mankind. He wasn't just a leader or a ruler. He was something greater, a being of unparalleled wisdom and power, guiding humanity toward a golden age. His primarchs called him Father. His warriors followed him with unwavering faith. And for a time, it seemed like his vision might actually work. The Imperium was expanding, the galaxy was being reclaimed, and despite the brutality of it all, there was still a sense of purpose behind it. But even then, cracks were forming. The problem with being seen as a father is that sooner or later, your children start asking questions. The primarchs, for all their loyalty, were not mindless tools. They had their own ambitions, their own interpretations of what the imperium should be. Some, like Guilliman and Dorn, followed the Emperor's ideals to the letter. Others, like Lorgar and Magnus, began to question him in ways that he either ignored or outright punished. And that was the first step toward disaster. Because the moment you put someone on a pedestal, the moment you elevate them to something more than human, their flaws become unbearable. Lorgar is the perfect example of this. He was devoted to the Emperor in a way none of the others were, not just as a leader, but as something holy. And when the Emperor rejected that worship, when he crushed Lorgar's dream of a god emperor, it shattered him. That betrayal, that refusal to embrace the role of divinity, is what ultimately drove Lorgar into the arms of chaos. And here's the irony. By trying so hard to deny his own godhood, the Emperor created the very faith that would destroy him. The Imperium's obsession with worship, its blind devotion, all of it started the moment the Emperor rejected the idea of being worshipped. And then came the Horus heresy. The Great Betrayal didn't just break the Imperium, it broke the idea of the Emperor. To those who remained loyal, he went from being an infallible father to something more distant, more untouchable. When Horus turned against him, when his sons waged war on each other, it became clear that the Emperor's vision had failed. And when he was finally entombed on the Golden Throne, barely alive, unable to speak, unable to rule, that's when everything changed. Without his direct guidance, without his presence, the Imperium had to reinvent him. And that's when the God Emperor was born. It wasn't an instant transformation, but a slow, creeping shift that turned him from a ruler into a divine entity. The same Imperium that once outlawed religion now worshipped him as the supreme deity. The Emperor, who had fought so hard to lead humanity through reason, became the very thing he despised, a figure of blind faith, his name used to justify everything from planetary purges to holy wars. And the worst part? It worked. The Imperium as it exists now needs the God Emperor. Without that belief, without the cult of the Emperor holding it together, the Imperium would collapse. It is an empire that runs on faith, on fear, on the idea that the Emperor is still watching, still guiding, still punishing those who stray from his path. And yet he is silent. Trapped on the Golden Throne, barely clinging to existence, he is powerless to stop what his empire has become. There's something deeply tragic about it all. The Emperor didn't just lose a war, he lost control of his own legacy. He tried to shape humanity's future, only to have that future warp into something beyond his control. The Imperium doesn't follow his vision anymore. It follows a twisted, corrupted version of it, one built on superstition and fanaticism. And the scariest part? If he did return, if he somehow rose from the throne and tried to fix what had been done in his name, there's a very real possibility that the Imperium wouldn't accept him. They might see him as a false prophet, a pretender, an enemy of their faith. The greatest tragedy of the Emperor is that he may no longer belong to himself. And yet, despite it all, he is still the center of everything. Whether he is a god or not no longer matters. What matters is that the Imperium believes he is. And in a universe where belief shapes reality, that might be more powerful than the truth itself. The Emperor's origins are one of the greatest mysteries in Warhammer 40k, and the fact that they remain unsolved after 10,000 years raises a big question. Will we ever truly learn the truth? And more importantly, what would happen if we did? If the Emperor's real history, his real nature, were ever fully uncovered, it could shake the very foundation of the Imperium. Because let's be honest, the entire Imperium is built on myths, half-truths, and outright lies. If those lies were ever exposed, would humanity even survive the revelation? One possibility is that the truth has already been lost forever. Whatever records existed about his past may have been deliberately destroyed by the Emperor himself or by those who came after him. Maybe he wanted to erase his own origins, to make himself an eternal enigma, something greater than a man with a past. If nobody knows where he came from, then nobody can challenge his authority. The less people understand, the more they are forced to rely on faith, and faith is what keeps the Imperium running. In that sense, the mystery of his origins is part of his power. But what if there are still answers hidden somewhere? What if, buried deep within the vaults of Terra, or locked away in some forbidden archive, there are records that tell the real story? If someone, an inquisitor, a rogue scholar, even a primarch, were to uncover them, the consequences would be staggering. Imagine if proof was found that the Emperor was never truly divine, that he was nothing more than an incredibly powerful psyker who manipulated humanity into following him. The ecclesiarchy would collapse overnight. Billions of faithful across the galaxy would fall into despair, and entire sectors of the Imperium might tear themselves apart in religious schisms. Or maybe the opposite is true. Maybe there's evidence that the Emperor was more than just a man, something far beyond even what his worshippers believe. What if he truly was a creation of the Old Ones, a weapon designed to fight chaos on a scale beyond mortal comprehension? What if he was never meant to be humanity's ruler at all, but something far greater, something even he might not have fully understood? If that knowledge were revealed, it could change everything. The Imperium might see itself not as a struggling empire, but as part of a war stretching back to the dawn of time, a conflict it was always meant to fight. And then there's the possibility that his past will only matter if he returns. Right now, the Imperium doesn't need answers. It needs faith. The myth of the Emperor is what holds everything together, and as long as he remains silent on the Golden Throne, that myth is safe. But if he were to wake up, if he were to rise and reveal the truth of who and what he really is, the Imperium might not be able to handle it. What if he is nothing like what they expect? What if he condemns their blind faith, tears down the ecclesiarchy, and demands they return to the imperial truth? Would they even listen? Or would the Imperium, so deeply entrenched in its worship of him, reject him outright? Some fans believe that the Emperor's return would not be a salvation but a reckoning. If he awakens, he will see an Imperium that is nothing like what he envisioned. He will see fanatics worshipping him as a god, an inquisition that burns anyone who dares to think for themselves, a galaxy drowning in war, stagnation, and ignorance. Would he even try to fix it? Or would he decide that humanity has already failed, that his dream is beyond saving? If that happens, then the Imperium may not just be facing its god's return, it may be facing its god's judgment. But there's another possibility, one far more terrifying. What if the Emperor never reveals the truth? What if he remains silent, trapped on the throne, while the Imperium continues to spiral further into madness? What if his origins, his true nature, are never discovered, and humanity is left forever clinging to a faith built on lies and half-truths? In that scenario, the Imperium becomes something even worse than what it is now, a civilization locked in eternal stagnation, unable to grow, unable to change, waiting for a savior who may never come. The truth of the Emperor's origins matters, not just because of what it could reveal, but because of what it means for the future. If humanity ever learns where he truly came from, if they ever understand what he really is, they will have to make a choice. Do they continue on the path they followed for 10,000 years, or do they finally step out of his shadow and carve their own destiny? The answer to that question could decide the fate of the entire galaxy. The Emperor of mankind is more than just a ruler, a psyker, or a god. He is the single most complex and enigmatic figure in the entire Warhammer 40K universe. His origins are a mystery, his actions are contradictory, and his legacy is a paradox. He is both humanity's greatest savior and its greatest tyrant. He built an empire meant to free mankind from superstition and ignorance, only for it to become a fanatical theocracy in his absence. He waged war to unify humanity, yet his own sons tore it apart. He wanted to protect his people from chaos, but in doing so, he created the perfect conditions for chaos to thrive. And the greatest tragedy? He saw it coming, and yet he still failed to stop it. There's something almost Shakespearean about the Emperor's story. He was brilliant, but blinded by his own arrogance. He was powerful, yet unable to prevent his greatest losses. He demanded absolute loyalty, but refused to give trust in return. He saw himself as the guiding hand of humanity, but in the end, he became its most tragic prisoner, entombed on the Golden Throne, unable to act, unable to speak, while the Imperium worships him as something he never wanted to be. His dream was twisted into something monstrous, and the worst part, it might be his fault. Because for all his power, for all his knowledge, the Emperor underestimated humanity. He believed he could shape them into something better, something logical and enlightened, but he ignored one fundamental truth. People will always believe in something greater than themselves. That's the irony of it all. The Emperor rejected faith, but faith is what kept the Imperium alive. He crushed religion, but in his absence, the Imperium built a god out of his image. And now, 10,000 years later, the question isn't whether the Emperor was a god. It's whether he has become one. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, where the warp is shaped by belief, where faith can turn myth into reality, the Emperor may no longer be what he intended. He may be what humanity has made him. But what happens next? Will his true origins ever be revealed? Will he return, and if so, as a savior, a tyrant, or something else entirely? These are the questions that define the future of Warhammer 40K. And the truth is, nobody knows. The Imperium is built on a foundation of secrets, on stories that may never be fully uncovered. If the Emperor wakes, if the Imperium learns the truth, the consequences will be beyond imagining. Will humanity embrace it? Or will they reject the reality in favor of the myth? One thing is certain, whether he is man or god, hero or villain, the Emperor's presence looms over everything. He is the past, the present, and possibly the future of mankind. His actions shaped the galaxy, his mistakes doomed it to eternal war, and his silence has allowed his legend to grow beyond his control. The Imperium lives in his shadow, fighting and dying in his name, waiting for a return that may never come. But if he does return, if the Emperor of mankind rises once more, the galaxy will never be the same again. The only question is, will it be saved or will it burn?